Well, we are here with Dr. Jeff Lamb, who is going to teach us about participles. So, um, well, before we do that, you want to tell us a little bit about your background and where you're at now and what you're doing?
Yes, I did my PhD in New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. It was during that time that it kind of made the name change to Trinity International University, although none of us claimed it at that point. And uh, did a New Testament. And when I finished in 95, there was no teaching job available immediately. So I came back to Oklahoma. I was an ordained United Methodist pastor. And so I pastored in rural Oklahoma for 5 years. About halfway through that, I got an adjunct teaching position at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, and kind of parlayed that into a full-time appointment. And I've been teaching there full-time since 2000. So it's been quite a while. And so I teach mostly, my appointment is in New Testament, but I mostly in the undergraduate world teach first-year Greek and hermeneutics, and in grad school teach a lot of varied Greek courses, and then do some PhD seminars as well. My primary research interest has become eco-theology in the last probably 15 years, I guess it's been by now. And, so just keep trying to find enough Greek students to enroll. So we did open up our biblical language courses to satisfy the foreign language requirement in general education. For a long time, we didn't allow that, the biblical language courses, but last couple of years we have, so our numbers are up. I've got 32 right now in my Greek 1 course. So
wow, awesome.
So that's kind of it's nice to see that people will take the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So
awesome. All right. Well, let's dive in.
Okay. One of the things that sometimes happens when you're in seminary, especially if you're in a Master of Divinity program, you've got a lot of students who are preparing for professional ministry. And what you end up finding sometimes is that a lot of people don't take language courses if they don't have to in their degree programs. And what we have sometimes is some very common misunderstandings about how these how different sorts of things have sort of become part of the fabric that we have in understanding ourselves, especially when it comes to something like the Great Commission in Matthew 28. Very, very famous passage. When you get to what we see here, the red letters, especially verse 19, here's where it kind of gets interesting. There is, the Great Commission, go therefore. If you're in the King James, it's go ye therefore. So it's got even more authority. So the go, make disciples, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teaching them everything teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. Now, when you hear a lot of, I don't know if you've heard these missionary sermons that sometimes come through churches. Eventually it all works around to where people are supposed to make one of two decisions. One is they will either become missionaries, which is not terribly likely, but the other is to support missions financially. And the great command there is go, and everything becomes go. And you do see that word is fronted in the clause. But what you do see, though, is, if you go over there and look at the beginning of verse 19, do you use Erasmian pronunciation or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So you have peruthentes here. This is a participle, and as such it can't serve as the main verb of the clause. But in the English translation, it looks like it. It looks like it's the command. It's the very first word of the sentence. And what you have is therefore this great imperative. Um, but what you see when you actually look at this passage, you see you've got the participle there to begin. The finite verb that we actually have here is mathetusate, which is make disciples, to discipleize, or something like that. But then we have a couple of other participles, the participle for baptizing, and then you have the participle for teaching down at the beginning of verse 20. So this Great Commission is actually, though it looks like the major idea in the passage is go, the finite verb that sort of that controls then the whole sentence is the verb make disciples. And then you can ask the question, after you've read Wallace and you see all these different ways that a participle might be construed adverbially, what you end up seeing is, all right, well then how then do we render these participles adverbially, if that's how we're going to go? And all those different categories, I guess, depends on which grammar you're reading. I was kind of amazed to find out that they all don't have the same list of possibilities, of categories. So Wallace can have 17 kinds of adverbial participles, and some other book might have 19 kinds of adverbial participles. But it looks like if you're going to do this, try to see these participles as adverbial, it looks like what you might do is see them as in some way kind of a coordinate idea, a circumstantial idea, maybe an adverbial participle of means. How does one go about making disciples? So maybe the translation of the sentence should be something like, make disciples by going into all the nations, by baptizing, et cetera, by teaching, et cetera. That I think can take away a little bit of the tendency to see the main verbal idea in our English translations as go. It looks like the translation. What translation is the one showing here on the screen?
This is the NRSV.
Oh, I see, NRSV. So it kind of looks like what the NRSV is doing in its translation is you do see the verbs for baptizing and teaching. Those look like they're translating participles, from Greek. But the very first one kind of looks like this. It looks like an imperative. So if you're going to look behind the curtain and see that this is a participle, then what you're looking at is maybe this is one of those categories that are sometimes called imperatival participles. Some commentators or some grammarians might list this passage as one of those rare places where the participle looks like it's functioning as imperatively. But there's kind of I think in that article I wrote, I cited somebody, maybe it was A.T. Robertson, that said, you really shouldn't appeal to calling a participle imperatival until you've exhausted all other possibilities. That seems fairly sage to me. So I think if you look at all these participles here, I think they all work very nicely adverbially. I think one can make that case an argument, and it's a more natural way of understanding the participle at that point. It's one of those things. When I was doing research for that one article, I looked at different grammarians and what they had to say about imperatival participles, and what you end up seeing is calling a participle imperatival. It seems like it's a little bit of an attempt to smooth out some difficulties. I think you can make a case that they are functioning functioning in other ways other than imperatively. Um, if one starts with the Greek text and doesn't keep in mind the English text that we've all learned um, associated with that. So, but I think it's always kind of fun. I had a missions professor whose office was across the hall from mine for many years, and it was amusing because he would always, when prospective students came to his office and were wanting to be missionaries, he would always come to this passage and look at it and say, "This is the command. We go. This is our command." And just so one day, I just kind of moseyed over to his office when he didn't have anybody there and said, "Well, it's not quite that simple. Um, it makes for a good sermon, but sometimes, what makes for a good sermon isn't actually what the text is saying." And, and I think that's kind of evident here. I don't know what all these symbols are. I have accordance. I don't know what all these arrows are doing, but it's interesting to me how, I don't know if these arrows are pointing to, like, here in verse
Oh,
19.
those
Are they?
are, this is a interlinear. So
Okay.
I think this is just saying make disciples as part of the same verb.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
I see.
yeah, I'm not,
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. That makes sense.
yeah.
I was kind of thinking, well, look, it's just kind of pointing to this main verb, and maybe, it's trying to say, here's the control center.
Yeah,
This
I'm not exactly sure what
Okay.
how they're functioning, but so when you approach difficult participles, is that kind of your method? You treat them as a participle. Um, yeah, like you said, don't call it something unique until you've exhausted all their
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah, and there are some passages that are easier than others, to do that with. I think the Great Commission passage works as a good example because we're so common, it's so commonly presented as a command, go, that we might tend to think of that participle as imperatival, but I think it works very well as in an adverbial understanding, because I just think it works. It works very nicely that way. And you often see, adverbial participles kind of fronted um, in clauses. You tend to see that quite a bit, and so I think it it's it's it works nicely in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah. Uh, what do you do with verbal aspect? What
Yeah,
camp are you in that, and how do you think through that with verbal aspect and participles?
yeah. We for years we taught out of Mounce's textbook. Um, and he makes the case, or he makes the argument that when you're talking about participles, aspect is the most important understanding of what the tense form brings to the table. But at the same time, it's really hard to translate in many cases. Sometimes you can't really get a good aspectual translation that makes any kind of English sense unless you're dealing with adjectival participles. Those work out pretty nicely. You can kind of the present participles you can kind of make look present, and then the aorist you can kind of make look aorist when you render them. But adverbial participles are sometimes tricky to do that with. Um, so uh, it is kind of um, it is kind of so I mean, here you've got, it looks like an aorist passive, well, probably deponent
Hmm.
participle. Here you've got present, where's teaching? Yeah, teaching's present. So, you know, the first thing you learn in translating participles is they're ing words. Of course, the problem is that there's like five things in Egypt in English that are ing words in the verb world. So, what I tend not to do much with aspect in terms of trying to come up with a translation. Um, uh, in preaching or something like that, it's it's easier to, I think, kind of bring out some of the aspectual stuff, but it's also hard sometimes to bring out aspect in a way that doesn't sound like an academic grammar lesson while you're
Right.
preaching.
Right.
Um, and if preaching and teaching in the local church is kind of where you're going, I think that becomes it becomes kind of tricky to bring that out. I think that's right. I think aspect is important. I remember when I was at Trinity, that's about the time Stan Porter published his big old massive book on that,
Mm.
and Don Carson was teaching an advanced Greek grammar, and um, we spent like three quarters or three-fourths of the quarter just studying that, um, as opposed to anything else to do with grammar. and so it was kind of the big deal then, and now it's like, if you want to see something like a WWF, pay-per-view, go to SBL and watch the biblical language and linguistics discussions on verbal aspect. You're going to get Stan Porter is going to kind of take his thing. There's no time in verbs, and then you're going to get Constantine Campbell, who's going to argue that, well, there can be some. There's only two aspects. Porter says there's three. Those get pretty worked up. Those meetings. It's pretty passionate over something as nerdy as verbal aspect, and but they get awfully
Mm-hmm.
involved. My take on it is, as the reader, if we're going to be preaching or teaching, we need to know what stuff is what that kind of um, uh, uh, input is coming from the verb tense forms. Um, how then you convey it, kind of, uh, is a little bit. It takes some explanation, and the hard part is, again, not making it sound like a grammar lecture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know, I remember asking Carson in class once. I said, all right, so we've spent, 8 weeks or however long going over Porter's book and taking deep dives into what verbal aspect contributes to our understanding of the Greek verb and all that. And I said, how many passages in the New Testament does this understanding effectively change our understanding of the meaning of the passage? I mean, are there places where, understanding aspect correctly just like overturns the apple cart with our understanding of passages? And he had a very short answer to it. He just said, I said, so how many passages are dramatically affected by this understanding? He said 6. And I don't know if he actually went through and counted 6, or if he was just kind of saying, well, not that many. But it becomes kind of a thing. I asked that to Con Campbell once. I asked him something like that, and he said, well, it's not that we're really going to change our understanding of things, but you're going to understand it with more precision now. And I mean that's fair. That's in an academic scholarly context. That's a valid goal to speak with more precision. But fundamentally, I think if we're looking at this, if we want to push some of that aspect really hard, this first one is, it's not really heavily marked. It's just an aorist participle. Um, it would make me think that what's happening here is, the present tense participles are more heavily marked than the going. So if you wanted to, try to communicate something to that effect, that apart from the finite verb of making disciples, um, the I think the aspect of the participles leans toward understanding baptizing and teaching to be of more significance to Jesus here than the going.
Mm.
I mean, the going is just kind of understood. You've got to do that. But the real work involved in disciple making is, it's handled more in baptizing and teaching. Um, and you could probably make, a case looking further down through church history that baptizing and teaching, you start seeing the coming together there of sort of like uh, catechetical kinds of context where there's instruction that precedes baptism. I mean, you can make those kinds of theological extensions from what's here. But I would probably, if I were preaching this, I'd want to make sure everybody understands the main idea is making disciples. But of the three actions connected with that, brought into connection with making disciples, I would say the going is the least emphasized of the sort of corded actions,
Hmm.
and focusing
So
on baptizing and teaching.
yeah, okay. So generally present participles are more marked than aorist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then perfect participles would be more heavily marked even then. So, I mean, one of the reasons that you see a lot of aorist tenses in, narrative context like this, one of the reasons that you see a lot of aorist tense forms, finite or, non-finite verbs, is, it helps you just basically chronicle action. You're just viewing an action as a sum, as a whole. You're just kind of acknowledging it and moving on to the things that you really want to point out more fully. So I think the going occupies an important role here. I mean, just in the sort of narrative logic of what Jesus is saying, but it also just kind of says it's just sort of acknowledging that going is part of this thing. But the real focus on disciple making seems to be leaning toward baptizing and teaching. Um,
Yeah.
and that's kind of, so it's almost, in comparison to the common sermon that we hear, it's almost inverted as to what's truly important in the passage. I think of all the verbal actions in verse 19, well, 19 and 20, I think the one that's least heavily marked or significant is the going.
Mhm.
Although you're, the making disciples too. I mean, in terms of the finite verb, it's aorist. Um, it's an aorist imperative. So, um, so you could probably play with that. I mean, whatever else is important here. Um, uh, this is probably just sort of, kind of keeping that sort of narrative identification of or chronicling of verbal actions. Making disciples is not just sort of jumping off the page and saying, "Pay attention to me," as an aorist imperative. The imperative itself, carries a little bit of more heavily marked sense, but the tense form is still aorist, and as a result, it's just kind of, in this kind of a context, it's just sort of marking, chronicling what's happening.
Okay. So outside of the standard grammars, BDF, Robertson,
Mm-hmm.
etc., are there any other like standard works of like references to participles or like um I mean even talking about markedness, are there any linguistic treatments of participles?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to take the deep dives into what people have been saying about verbal aspect, um, those are important works. The difficulty with Porter's book, I think, I mean, it was the first one really. I guess Fanning had his book first, and that's what kind of spurred Porter's interest in the idea of verbal aspect. Then Porter took the deep dive, and um, and then he sort of became kind of the voice around that for a while. Carson kind of took his side in the debate. He thought that, at least in the early 90s when all this was going on, Carson was very much in the Porter camp. But then discussions started evolving a little bit, kind of questioning whether or not this is the way to go. Um, a much more accessible book is one by Constantine Campbell on verbal aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the title escapes me right now,
The
but
basics of verbal aspect.
yeah, I think that's a good place to start. I mean, you learn in your. Did you all use mounts to kind of
Yeah.
do Greek 1 and 2?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so mounts gives you a kind of a little bit of a treatment there. He can't really decide, I don't think, where he wants to land on verbal aspect. Um, I think he just wants to make everybody happy, and um, as a result, I don't think he probably makes anybody happy. But that's a good place to start. Obviously, the reference grammar. I mean, just kind of seeing what a guy like Wallace does with it. Wallace, I don't. Wallace, if I remember correctly, he's not really. He's more in the Buste Fanning camp.
Right. Yeah. I think that's
And
right.
then you got Campbell coming along now, uh, sort of as the next generation of guy who's kind of really getting involved in this. And so he goes with I mean, some of his nomenclature is different, but he's a two aspect guy, um, where he sees the perfect tense and the pluperfect tense um, as being somehow a more intensified form of an imperfective aspect.
Hmm.
Um, I use. I don't know if you all. Nobody's old enough anymore to remember this, but there was a classic movie. I think from the late 80s or early 90s, somewhere in there, called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I don't know if you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Um, but there's a kind of a major scene in the movie where there's a parade. I think it's a St. Patrick's Day parade in downtown Chicago, and um, and so Ferris Bueller and two of his friends are skipping school to have a fun day. Well, there's this big parade coming down the road, and people on both sides of the road watching it, and the camera kind of enters this scene from above, like looking down from a skyscraper onto the parade. And that's kind of that sort of represents what you see with the uh, the perfective aspect, the aorist tense might do. You see the whole thing at once. You're not viewing it from within the action itself. You just kind of see it all at once as a summarized whole. That would be something like the perfective aspect. Then the camera goes to Ferris's two friends who are they're kind of walking along the curb, and they kind of see the action of the parade happening from within the action. So that's the imperfective aspect. So you're kind of seeing it there. Now, what Porter would do with that is then go to the third aspect, which would be like the stative aspect that the perfect tense grammaticalizes. So then, what he would do is say, all right, when the parade is over, then the custodial crew has to come in and tear down the barricades and sweep the street and pick up all the trash. So you've had the complete action of a parade with the sort of residual state of affairs that's come to be, namely the mess from the parade. And that would be Porter's understanding. What like Campbell would argue is, well, no, what the perfect tense grammaticalizes is a more intense or up close viewing of the action from within it. So instead of Ferris's two friends, watching this happen, what we then see is all of a sudden Ferris Bueller himself shows up on one of the floats. So he's actually taking part in the parade. He's viewing the parade from right up, a more intense internal perspective.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of you can on YouTube, you can go look for like the Ferris Bueller's Day Off parade scene, and it takes like a minute and a half or something like that. But I think it's a fairly good visual representation of what the aspect system does. And even with like Campbell's take on it, where he sees two aspects instead of three in Greek, I think it does a real good job of illustrating that. And
Okay.
so if you've not seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you can at least go see the one little scene there, and it's cute, it's amusing. Um, it was a good example of those 1980s sort of teen adventure sorts of movies. And, you know, it. I don't think it's aged terribly well, but then again, very few things do. So
Yeah. Um, I guess any questions, Chad or Troy, that you have?
So I had a question on I think it was Matthew 2,
Okay.
um 20 or 21. And I was diagramming the sentence, and there's a participle in there that is a quote of the Old Testament.
Okay.
So see if we can find it here.
Oh yeah, it's the one that's like get up and take the child. And
Was it
it's
this
Well,
one?
it was
Rachel crying?
Rachel crying. Yeah. So a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled.
okay. Okay. Yeah, they're in
And
verse 18. Yeah.
um, which one of those is a participle?
Right here.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Oh, Clausa.
Clausa. So um, weeping.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there's a chi in there, which is kind of hard to decide what to do with because
Mm-hmm.
it's like she was weeping. So you think of a participle that's kind of like an adjectively describing what else she was doing, right? But because it's a quote of the Old Testament, um, Leedy's sentence diagrams, I was checking my work with him, the New Testament sentence
Mm-hmm.
diagrams from Randy Leedy, and he just treats it as a normal verb, not as a participle. So I was curious what you would do with that.
Yeah. In looking at this, I would say, it's one of those things that the very first definition we learn of a participle is it's a verbal adjective. Um, and the power of a participle as a verbal adjective, I think, especially when you're leaning toward the adjectival side of that in a particular context, is it gives us a very vivid description of, in this case, a person in terms of their action. So I would see this probably, just as an adjectival participle, um, that's modifying Rachel. And um, and I think that, so what it's doing is instead of, you could have just as easily used a finite verb for weeping. um, you know, and that would have been a fairly, you know, standard way of doing something like that. I think the advantage here at the level of the Greek text, I think the advantage of using the participle is we're getting a more vivid description of Rachel. Rachel's seen as a weeping person.
Mm-hmm.
That's what kind of person she is. So she's described in terms of a verbal action. One of the things that makes this kind of thing difficult is, if you're dealing with if this lines up more with the Septuagint, then you're, having to go back and see, well, how is the Septuagintal translator, how is that translator understanding this? What's the Hebrew form behind it? Is it a participle, or is it something else? Um, that might help you understand the passage a little bit better. But I mean, our task is to read the Greek text that Matthew's put forward for us here. But I would see it as functioning pretty much like an adjective. But the thing about an adjective of this nature is uh, it powerfully attributes some kind of descriptor um, to the noun that it's modifying. And I think,
So
so I would probably, in terms of diagram it like an adjective.
so one of the things, like you can see in the translation here, they haven't done anything with the chi.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do with the chi there? It's just kind of left out in
I
the
mean,
English.
at some level, I mean, chi is just kind of um, it functions more, syntactically as, a kind of sort of a paratactic, um, setting up a paratactic relationship, just ideas after another. So there's no idea of subordination here. This is just kind of, here's something, here's something, here's something. My suspicion is that probably what lies behind it is, you've got the different the uses of vav in the Hebrew text.
Yeah.
And it may be that the reason the kais are here is basically just in mimicking the Hebrew. It might be that that's what's going on there. And as such, when you look at Hebrew syntax, I mean, you've got all those vavs in there that are just kind of linking things together so that you have this conceptual unit going on. And that might be, the translators sometimes very slavishly or probably, like Mark overdoes the kais like crazy. And but what it does, if you put them all in there, and actually pronounce them, you're seeing how ideas are linked together. This and this and this and this and this. So it very much mimics what Hebrew's trying to, what Hebrew accomplishes by using the conjunction in so repeatedly. But that's, a lot of translations just, they're not going to translate them, especially NRSV tries to get away from over translating the conjunctions if it can. Sometimes what they do is they just put commas in. Sometimes if it makes for a list. But all it's doing syntactically is just sort of, I think, setting up a paratactic relationship. This and this and this. So it's a very linear presentation.
Awesome. Any more questions?
Thank you.
All right.
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Yes, I mean, participles, I don't know, well, Luke might have been a better teacher than a lot of people by saying, trying not to scare you to death with participles. I mean, it always seemed to me like when I was in school taking Greek, and the people who had taken Greek before me, they'd always, are you to participles yet? Are you to participles yet? And we're at the participles. We're getting ready to do participles. Yeah, we are. And then they would go, oh my goodness, participles. I don't know about participles. Those, if you can master the participle, you can master the language. Well, I mean, that's just kind of patently absurd. You master the language by mastering the language. You can't really just, I'm only going to focus on nouns in a language. You can't really do that. You've got to focus on all of it. But aside from that, I think, the biggest enemy of learning participles well is probably previous Greek students who are just trying to, scare you, but also kind of tout their own achievement and having conquered it or something. So participles, I'm this year I'm using, since I'm teaching mostly Gen Ed students now, Greek, I switched from Mounce's book, which I used last year, and that was just way too much for a lot of people who weren't really going to be Greek scholars or New Testament scholars. And I went over to Constantine Campbell. Campbell and Gibson have written this kind of very bare bones grammar, and it gets rid of all that extra information that Mounce has, which is useful if you want to know the nuts and bolts of how the language works. If you're just trying to kind of get at the New Testament, I think Mounce's book is overkill probably for first year students. But I think, so what Campbell does is when he introduces participles pretty early in the process, he just says, for now, just translate everything ing and we'll work at it later. And I think there's a fair amount of wisdom in that, because it's just like with genitives. If you translate every genitive case you come across with of, well, then you can kind of go back and just sit down calmly and say, well, what kind of is this? I mean, in English, what kind of am I looking at here? And we can kind of intuit our way around it, even though we might not be able to apply a technically precise description to it, grammatically speaking. And I think participles work that way. Sometimes we get so hung up on categorizing the participle, when in actuality, what we really need to be doing is just kind of seeing, let's just kind of put a placeholder in there, an ing word that moves us through the text as we're reading. And then we can kind of go back and get some precision with it. So I think, like with the Great Commission, you could probably sort of just say, well, it looks like baptizing and, going, baptizing, teaching. Those are just ways that you get the job of making disciples done. Okay, well, then you can go ahead and try to, open up Wallace and come up with the precise label you want to apply to that. But I think, that first step into learning and just kind of seeing so that you can begin working your way through the text. Sometimes that's I think, a helpful way to go about it. It's just kind of, these are ing words to start with, and we'll get more precise as we go. And I mean, Mounce tries to do something like that, but he just sort of introduces it all at once. All right, so here's all these different participle forms. Here's your present tense participle forms. And then right now we're going to treat these as adverbial, so translate all of them with while or something like that. He starts with. But then when you get to the workbook, sometimes the word while doesn't give you a real good smooth rendering. An ing form would have been just fine. And then students have questions about that. And so I think it's, if you can kind of take your time with it, break it up a little bit. I think maybe sometimes the problem with teaching participles is we just do it all at once. So you hit that section of Mounce's textbook, there's 5 chapters that deal with participles, and you just sort of immerse yourself in them, drown in them, and then you just kind of hope as you're bobbing along the rip current, you eventually get back to shore. And so I think there's, sometimes we hurt ourselves by getting too technical with the participles at the front end. Maybe we need to kind of back off and take it a little more slowly, a little more easily, and then you can always go into that. You can always become Daniel Wallace at some point.
Yeah, I love the participles, just how well Greek uses participles way more than English.
Yeah.
And so you can see more kind of the structure, kind of what you pointed out here of, your main verb and then these 2 participles explaining further what it means to make disciples. Or I love like the Ephesians 5 right here, be filled with the Spirit.
Right.
That's the main verb. And then how do we do it? And then in our English translations, it's hard to translate all of these, but so be filled with the Spirit, singing psalms, and so on, giving thanks at all times, everything in the Lord. And then over here, being subject one to another, but they translate them as imperatives there. So all of those, subjecting ourselves, singing psalms, it's all part of
and
filled in the Spirit.
This passage is really sometimes abused in English translations because, when you get to that one about being subject to one another, I mean, look what they've done here. They've created a new paragraph and a new heading.
Yeah.
Separates the ideas. So it gives you the impression when you're reading, and then they're kind of forced to render it as an imperative at that point. So we've kind of imposed a sort of presentation onto the text that really doesn't get at what the text is doing. You're right. All those things are, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think they're all present tense participles. So they're kind of viewing this thing from within. This is a process. This isn't, something you can check off of a checklist saying, okay, I've done that now. I can move on to the next. we're always viewing these verbal actions in process. And I think, I think just in this respect, just simple ing words to start actually gets us pretty far down the road, because when you see the ing in English, we tend to think of things kind of in process, something that's sort of an ongoing thing, if you want to say it that way. And it just makes sense. And then if we can get people to just kind of ignore chapter and verse boundaries, that's one thing you were talking about Hebrews earlier. Wanted to look at Hebrews. I did a translation of Hebrews a while back, and for something, and the one thing I know for sure is that whoever put the chapters and verses in that letter had no idea what Hebrews is saying. They wouldn't have put some of those chapter divisions where they did, and some of those verse boundaries where they did, if they had any idea what Hebrews is saying. And if you go through, I had a student do this once. He turned out to be a lawyer, so I guess that explains things. But he went in and took out all of the chapter and verse numbers and just kind of formatted it as just a continuous text. I think he kept the paragraph boundaries in place. But once you take away the verse numbers and stuff like that, I think sometimes you can see relationships better. And this Ephesians 5 passage is a perfect example of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great passage because, be filled with the Spirit, that's kind of the thesis. And then how do you do that? It's interesting here that, they translate this, and it can be translated. I mean, laleo, it's really more of kind of a more generic verb of speaking. And then you get down here where you actually have a song or a word about singing and making melody. But so I think kind of the translation here, lets us down a little bit. I would probably just have said this: saying psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves. Then you can get into liturgical discussions as to what all that even means. And it could be that this next clause is just sort of refining it a little bit, or almost like a poetic parallelism. If you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, then let's go back and revisit, well, that's singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts. Maybe there's a little bit more of a poetic parallelism going on in this passage as well.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So,
okay.
But yeah, thank you for this, taking us and answering our questions.
Yeah, it's whenever you deal with participles, there's always more. There's so much more to do. There's so many great examples throughout the New Testament that you can go into, but some of these basic passages, I think, like the Great Commission and the one in Ephesians 5, are really good entry points to kind of illustrate why is studying participles meaningful. Why is it important to see them as they're, how they're functioning, and then you can always go into more. Like the question about Matthew 2, great question. What do you do when you're trying to deal with the text as Greek, but this is a very explicit situation where there was a translation from an underlying Hebrew that probably exerted a lot of pressure on what the syntax looked like in Greek. And, so yeah, there's all kinds of fun stuff when you're looking at translated texts as well. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice